Are you familiar with the concept? Okay. Well, the ones that are not familiar, you'll discover it in a minute.
What did it show?
I was not going to give a definition.
Okay. Hi. Thank you all so much for being here. This is really great to see you all. Now, if you haven't been to storytelling before, it's the oldest art form. Long before we were painting on cave walls, we were telling each other stories about who we were and where we've been. So I like to think that I'm part of this long chain. And as you'll hear, it's not the only long chain that I think we're all part of. Now, if you haven't been before, storytelling is like kind of an intimate and friendly art. So I'm not going to call on anyone. I'm not going to ask anyone to like say anything. But you might enjoy it more if you're a little bit closer to the front. So sit wherever you're comfortable, but just know that if you decide to sit in the front, all that's going to happen is I might smile at you a little bit more than I smile at you back there. Yeah? Is everyone set? Great. So, it's 1999, and I'm in a big green park in Minneapolis. And the thing you have to understand about Minneapolis in June is the weather is stunning. You see, it tries to apologize in June for snowing for the last 9 months. So June is gorgeous. And there's, I don't know, maybe a couple thousand people in this park. And it's a big park. So we're kind of being eaten up by all the green space. And there's a little row of stalls selling, kind of fare, the things you sell at fairs. It's my first Pride, but I'm also in the closet. You see, when I was in high school, my girlfriend and I got caught. And I don't really have a short way of talking about it, so I'm just gonna say, after a couple of really, really difficult months, it was clear that I had to make a choice. I could be out to my family, and that would mean that I would have to find somewhere else to live with the $500 that I'd managed to save from babysitting, and that I couldn't go to university. Remember, university in the US is really, really expensive. Like, at this point, it's like $15,000 a year to go to a state school, and any loan or financial aid that you get depends on your parents' income. So I had known kids who had gotten caught and gotten kicked out. And they were living in shelters, crashing on people's couch, but they were never going to go to university. So that was one option. My other option was to lie. I could go back into the closet, and I had just gotten into, it's okay, you guys, come on in. No, go for it. I'm telling about my first Pride and telling why I was in the closet for my first Pride. Why doesn't everyone sit? Come, there's some seats over here. Sorry, y'all, it's going to be easier for us to get everyone seated. Come sit up front. I promise not to call on anyone. I promise not to call on anyone up front. There's one right here. I know everyone's really worried about it, so I just want to be clear. No one's getting called on. No one's getting called out. This isn't stand-up comedy. I'm not going to make fun of anyone. Okay, so for you guys who just came in, I'm explaining why I was in the closet at my first Pride. I had just gotten into the theater school of my dreams. And so I said to myself, it's 4 years. I can lie for 4 years. So I go across the country, I go to my first year of university, and I have to tell you all, I was the most obnoxious person you've ever seen. There's this thing that happens. I think it happened more back then than it does now, but there's this thing that happens when you first come out where you make it your entire conversational identity. So what would happen is that I would meet someone and they'd be like, hi, I'm Eric, or hi, I'm Sarah. And I'd say, hi, I'm a lesbian. You guys, I'm not a lesbian. I'm bisexual. I have always known that I'm bisexual. But I was so excited to finally be able to tell people my identity that I just really hopped on the crazy train and put in as much coal as I could. So after like 8 months of this, I have to go live at home for the summer because of finances. So I go from being out and proud and very, very loud about it to back in the closet. Sorry, it's okay, come on. There's one there and there's one over here. Oh, okay, we're almost out of seats. So we've got one over here, we've got one over there, and we got one over here. Sorry, y'all. And then we got one there and we got one there. Yeah? Okay. This should be it, I'm thinking. Yeah? All right. So because I'm in the closet, I have to find a way to kind of cover where I am. I'm a little embarrassed to point out that this is before cell phones are really common, so I didn't have a cell phone. But I did have a friend who knew to cover for me. So I told my parents I was with that friend, and then I just went. And it felt so amazing. I'd never been to Pride before, so I didn't know what to expect. But it just felt so amazing to be with my people. And I bought this necklace because I was having a phase where I was trying to pretend I was going to be butch. I think you can tell that that didn't work. I tried it. And so I bought this necklace, and I'm walking, and I run smack into someone I was friends with in high school. Now, she graduated before me, so she didn't know everything that had happened my senior year. And we just dove into each other's arms, and we hugged each other, and then we kind of pulled back. And she goes, "Wait a second, are you?" And I was like, "Yeah." "Wait a second, are you?" And she goes, "Yeah." And we hug each other again, and there's a group of like 30 and 40-year-old people near us who start clapping. Now, I've told that story to a friend of mine who's about 15 years younger than me, and she didn't understand it. So in case any of you are in that boat, what happened with me and my friend from high school was a much more common thing for my generation and for the generation ahead of me. Because it was much, much less common to be able to come out while you were still in school. And you know, Minneapolis isn't a huge city, so the community is small. So you would have these moments where you ran into someone you used to be close to, and you found out there was a reason you were so close. And the thing I think about a lot with that moment is the way it was a generational passing of the torch. That what they experienced watching me and my friend was different from what they had experienced in their own lives. And then, of course, my own friend hasn't experienced this at all. And that sense of generation in the queer community, that's not just now. That has been going on for a long time. So I want to tell you about 3 overlapping generations that came out of the Jewish community here. I'm going to start with Jacob. Now, just a note before I go, I'm going to do my very best to keep to American pronunciations for Dutch and Hebrew words, because I notice that people get distracted by my accent. If I slip up, I'm sorry. So Jacob was born in 1881, and he was born into a community that was experiencing a lot of change, both the Jewish community and the Dutch community. So for most of Dutch history, homosexuality had been an act, a sin, a crime, but it was something that people did. No one thought of it as like something that was internal. It was something that someone chose to do. Jacob was born into a world where things were just starting to shift, and people were just starting to talk about maybe attraction is something that's internal and not something you choose. Now, it wasn't happening perfectly. Around the time that Jacob was born, there was this movement called the Tachtigers, which was like the group from the 80s. Ooh, I hit Dutch pronunciation right away. And they were trying to remake art. They were trying to use art to create a more equal society. And there were 2 people in the Tachtigers that I think show how uneven this progression was. One of the leaders of the Tachtigers, this guy named Willem, he was attracted to his male friend, and he was carving his insides out about it. He was so distraught by his attraction to men that eventually he actually voluntarily underwent electroshock therapy. At the same time, there was a woman in this group named Sarah Desfar who just seemed to like get on with it. She moved to Amsterdam, she dated a woman, moved in with that woman, then went to Rotterdam, dated another woman, then moved in with another woman here, and then like spent the rest of her life traveling with that woman. So, Sarah Desfar. We'll talk later. I can give you some more info about her. So it was, kind of happening unevenly. And this is, again, the group of the 80s. This is like a big artistic group that really influenced Jacob. The other change that was happening was within the Jewish community. So 100 years before Jacob was born, almost the entirety of Dutch Jews lived in insular communities in the cities. And Yiddish was the primary language. After Yiddish, there was Spanish, then Portuguese, and Dutch was like, fourth on the list. By the time Jacob was born, almost every Dutch Jew spoke Dutch. And they were living all over the country. In fact, Jacob was born in this small village right near Drenthe, but a very, very small village. And not long after he was born, the family moved to Zaandam, where his father was a cantor and a teacher and a lecturer and basically everything for this tiny, tiny synagogue in Zaandam. Jacob's sister, Carrie, they were actually born in the same year. Carrie was January and Jacob was December. Carrie also went on to be a writer. This is Carrie van Brugge. And she wrote a book called The House on the Ditch about their growing up. And she describes this very narrow world that the children were experiencing. They grew up in a lot of poverty. They faced anti-Semitism from the other kids in the village. And the father was someone who dealt with the pressures of what they were experiencing with a lot of rage. He yelled a lot. And from a very young age, Jacob was the kind of person that would respond to that rage with this kind of cool, icy sarcasm to just kind of really get in his father's face by not reacting. And that was something Jacob would carry for the rest of his life. He was lucky enough to be able to go to school in Haarlem when he was 14, and by 18, Jacob was an entirely different person. He was living in De Pijp. He had gone entirely away from the Orthodox faith of his father, and he really, really embraced Marxism and socialism. He was writing for the Socialist Daily Paper, he was a member of the party, and in 1903, he got this opportunity to just really relish that kind of fighting spirit. There was a railway strike, and Jacob just dove in, feet first, to really being a speaker and getting in everyone's faces and really trying to basically get everyone mad. I don't know if you guys know anyone like this, but Jacob was the kind of person that relished attention, and he didn't really seem to differentiate between positive and negative attention. It was just attention. Yeah, I see some of you know that. I know that as well. The other thing that happened around now is at some point Jacob figured out that he was gay. And from his writing, which very much veers into the autobiographical, there's a couple different ways this could have happened. It's possible that he had an affair at school. It's possible that he kind of stumbled into the gay subculture in De Pijp and had an affair that way. It's possibly more likely that it was through a man named Arnold Alatrino. So Arnold had started to really make waves. He was a lecturer at the university. And he had started to really make waves by writing these papers that talked about gay men as people. And remember, this is after centuries of treating homosexuality as a crime. Literally, we've just gotten past a century in which it was illegal to be gay, and there were waves of anti-gay prosecutions all through the 1700s. So it's a bit radical what Arnold's doing, just talking about gay men as people. In fact, around the time that Jacob was doing this railway strike, he was the center of this huge academic scandal because he went into this conference and he just had this very humane way of talking about gay men. He was like, this is just who we are, although he didn't use we. I think he probably should have used we. I don't know, but I think from his writing that he came from a very personal place. So we don't know quite what the relationship was between Jacob and Arnold. What we do know is that Jacob wrote a book. Pipelines was the first book to talk about gay men without condemning, with no moralizing, just talking about a gay relationship. And it went off like a bomb. I have to say, I really identify with this moment. It's actually really hard. Like it's just a room full of us right now, right? It was actually kind of hard for me just to talk to you guys about my own Pride experience, to say nothing of writing a book that thousands read. But I got through it by thinking about my first Pride in New York. So I moved to New York after university, and finally I could be out. I didn't owe anyone anything. I could finally just be myself. So I went to the first Pride in New York, or my first Pride in New York. And if you don't know, the Pride Festival marks the Stonewall riots, which happened in New York in 1969. And Stonewall is this gay mecca on Christopher Street. So it's a bar, but it's become something more. So the parade goes down Fifth Avenue. And Fifth Avenue is just this huge, broad boulevard. I mean, I actually can't think of a street this wide in Amsterdam. Maybe if you could walk down the Weesperstraat, maybe, but it's like this huge, broad boulevard. And so I'm standing with my friends, and so the parade goes down Fifth Avenue, and then it turns at this park, and then from the park, it goes to Christopher Street and to the Stonewall Inn. And so I'm standing with my friends, and we're watching this parade. And it's like a little bit like the Canal Parade, and like there's like, you know, there's drag queens dancing, there's floats, there's all these different bands, and so there's lots of music and costumes. But what I didn't expect is there's also just a bunch of everyday people, just normal people, just walking down the street to say, I'm here. And I look at my friends, and I say, I'll see you at Christopher Street. And I slip under the police barricade, and I'm walking down Fifth Avenue. And it feels like flying. I have never been as happy as I was in that moment, to just be there and be seen. And I start chatting with a girl just like me who slipped the barricade and is walking down the street. I start chatting with an Afro-Latino girl, and she starts telling me about her experience. So she's in high school, and she's from a really, really rough part of New Jersey. And her family and friends have reacted really badly to her coming out. She's facing, she's really scared. She's facing pushback, and she's not sure what's gonna happen next. And so as we're walking, you know, I just kind of took her hand, not in like just in a supportive way. And I just listened to her. And when she was done, like obviously like I gave her sympathy, but then I said, I want you to know that that was the hardest thing you're going to ever do. That from here on out, it just gets better. And it's not going to be perfect, and you know, you're going to have ups and downs, but your friends and family don't understand the strength it took for you to do that. And we have kind of this beautiful moment, and then we just get lost into the chaos and pandemonium of Christopher Street. And even though I was only a little bit older than her, I think that's an example of why this generational contact is so important. That things shift slightly for each generation, but if we're doing it right, we can be supports for each other. So around the time that Jacob was publishing Pipelines, over on the Stadhoudersgade, Frida Belafonte was born. She was born to a Jewish musician, and his family was huge. He was like one of 10 siblings. He was also the only sibling to not marry a Jewish person. Every other sibling stayed in the community. And Frida for the rest of her life, was really, really influenced by her Jewish family members. So I listened to this interview that she did at 90 years old. And at 90 years old, she talked about Friday night dinners with her grandparents. And it was something that really, as you'll see, influenced a lot of her choices. So as Frida's growing up, Jacob's dealing with the fallout of this book, and it's intense. For starters, Jacob named one of the lovers after Arnold. He used Sam, which was a nickname for Arnold. And Jacob named one of the other lovers after him. He used Yop, which was a nickname for Jacob. And there was a bunch of pseudo-biographical details about this couple. And Arnold was so upset that he bought every copy he could get his hands on and destroyed it. Meanwhile, the socialist paper that Jacob was working for fired him publicly. And they fired him, this may sound small, but this was an important nuance. They fired him calling him Mr. Dahan instead of Comrade Dahan, which is what you're supposed to do if you're talking about someone who's a member of the party. And as you might be able to guess from how I talked about Jacob earlier, he went in for the fight. He went in for everyone. He fought with the Socialist Party. He fought with every single critic who dared to say anything negative about the book. He rewrote it so that any relationship and any reference to Arnold was gone. And he republished it, and instead of a dedication to Arnold at the front, which there used to be, he put a Catullus quote, who's a Roman poet. And as soon as that happened, he decided to write a sequel. I think about that so much. The fact that he's like someone who will just double down. But he's also a really young guy when this is happening. He's in his 20s. So in addition to this, he's trying a bunch of different paths. So he writes the sequel, and he's trying to get the sequel published. And as he's having trouble getting the sequel published, he starts studying at university for a master's degree. And then he gets married in what even at the time is described as a marriage of convenience. And he's looking for all these different routes. And he eventually publishes a book called Pathologies, which is another book that focuses on a gay relationship in a way that is not particularly flattering or healthy, the relationship that's described. And people don't even have the shock of last time. Like, he still gets the criticism, but he doesn't get the shock factor, so he's like, you know what, that's it. No more fiction, I'm going into poetry. So he starts exploring poetry, and then he gets his attention pulled aside. When he was part of the Socialist Party, he had heard about what was happening in Russian prisons. So there was a bunch of people who were fighting to undermine the Tsarist government. And when they were captured, they just lived in these terrible conditions. So Jacob decided he was going to go to Russia to see this firsthand. And he did. He made it all the way to Russia. He took copious notes and reports. And he came back here and he published a book called In Russian Prisons. And this had an impact. It spearheaded a campaign that Jacob was part of to collect signatures to try and get governments to force the Tsar to treat prisoners better. In fact, to this day, Amnesty International refers to Jacob as one of their forerunners. And as this is happening, Jacob finds himself returning to the faith of his youth. And there's a bunch of different stories about this, and no one seems to know what actually happened. One story is that he was step by step, little bit by little bit. Another story is that he was walking through a park at sunset, and he heard a child's voice telling him to return to the Lord God. Whatever happened, by 1912, he was living according to Orthodox principles. And he was began writing these beautiful books of poetry called Jewish songs. And they were really, really impactful here. But it also started the conflict that was going to define the rest of his life. because it didn't stop him being attracted to men. So for the rest of his life, he would write these poems that kind of like went back and forth between this experience of being attracted to men and feeling like there wasn't room for that in his faith, and he just kept fighting back and forth. By 1919, he decided there wasn't a place for him in Amsterdam and that he wanted to move to what is now Israel and help build the new state. While that was happening, Frida had learned to play cello from her father and had done her first public performances as a cellist. And through her cello teacher, had met her first girlfriend, Henrietta. As Frida and Henrietta are taking their first steps towards a relationship, there's a young boy who's being born. Not that much, there we go. Benno Premsela was born to a doctor named Benedictus Premsela, and he started growing up in Amsterdam as well. Unfortunately, in Israel, Jacob found much the same that he'd experienced here. He was always at odds with everyone. And as the political conflicts around the formation of the State of Israel intensified, Jacob was assassinated. His sister, as a eulogy, published his work that he'd written in what is now Israel, and she said as a kind of a eulogy quote that men hated him because of two things: because he asked too much and because he gave too much. You know, I think something that gets lost in this pride discourse a little bit is what it can feel like to be on the outside of the community. It's so powerful to have these moments where we all feel like we're connecting together. But if you don't feel welcome in the community, that's an incredibly alienating and painful thing. A few years after that time that I told you about, I was once again on Christopher Street, but this time I'm standing alone. And I'm not sure why. It seems like everyone around me is like pairs and friends, and everyone's laughing and having a good time. I'm trying to figure out what happened to the friend that I came with. I'm actually about to discover him throwing up in an alley. But I'm also really hoping to not run into a group of lesbians from the theater that I'm working at, because I asked them if they wanted to do Pride with me. And one of them, who knew my backstory, I had done a theater piece about what I'd experienced as a teenager, so she knew where I was coming from. But when I asked her if she wanted to go to Pride with me, she said, "I don't think straight girls should go to Pride." Yeah. So apparently she didn't think there should be a B in the LGBTQ. So I'm hoping not to run into her, and I get my friend, I find him, and I'm trying to like coax him, 'cause he's bigger than me. I'm trying to like coax him into a cab. And as this is happening, I have this quick memory of something I overheard as a teenager. See, like a lot of queer kids, I started listening to queer adults long before I was willing to admit anything to myself. But I knew who the queer adults were in my church, I knew who they were in the theater groups, and I would just kind of, get myself near them so I could listen to what they were saying. And I was listening to two men who were survivors of the AIDS crisis, which was a crisis in which the gay community was just left to rot by the government. And I was listening to them talk about alcoholism and addiction in the community. And one of them said, "Well, I don't think there's any question that we're a community in need of healing." And as I'm trying to get Steve into the cab, I was shocked that 15, 20 years later, that was still so true. It kind of showed up in Frida and Henrietta's relationship as well. They would be very intense and very, passionate with each other. And Henrietta was a composer, and she wrote a whole concerto for Frida. And she formed a trio with Frida and this other flautist. But also, they had some pretty rocky times. Henrietta would cheat on Frida, and Frida was always kind of a caretaker. So she would try to make things okay. Finally, after years and years of this, Frida left. She got herself an apartment down the street from her mother because her mother had been suddenly widowed. Her father knew he was sick, but didn't want to tell anyone. So his death seemed very sudden to the family. And Frida just tries to build her life. And everything that I'm telling you about, I actually have from an interview that she gave at the end of her life. So I'm telling you Frida's perspective of it. And Frida's perspective is, she doesn't really identify with, she doesn't really think of herself as queer, she just likes women, and she sleeps with women, and she has relationships with women. And I think that's such an interesting contrast to Jacob, but that's where Frida was at this point, in the 1930s, where she lived with a woman, that was her primary relationship, but she didn't necessarily think of herself as queer. Benno, meanwhile, is becoming an art student, and all is going well. He's expanding his artistic palette. And then when Benno's 20 and Frida's 36, the Nazis invade. And you guys know what that was. It's incredibly scary, challenging. Frida's brother had lived in the east of the country, and Frida's brother had married a Jewish woman. So he considered himself Jewish and was considered Jewish. And Frida was sitting with her mother in the days after as the invasion was starting, because of course part of the invasion was all the phone lines were cut. So they didn't know, they didn't have any word of Frida's brother. And then a phone call came in saying that Frida's brother had committed suicide. And Frida left her girlfriend to take care of her mom, and she ran to the embassy. And she actually got this guy from the American embassy to give her a car, so that in the middle of, again, the invasion is happening. Frida jumped in a car and drove east. She found out that her brother had already been buried by the time she got there, but that her brother's wife had gone into hiding. And this was Frida's first contact with the resistance. And she would go on to play a major part in the resistance. I don't know if you guys know this, but as a foreigner, when you first start learning about Amsterdam, you start learning about the resistance, the first thing you hear about is the bombing of the city registry. Have any of you guys, was that your experience as well? Has anyone heard of that? Mm-hmm. Cool. Had you heard about the queer people at the center of it? Excellent, excellent.
Most of them.
Excellent, yes.
As well, yeah.
Exactly. Oh, I'm so glad to hear that.
A week ago on Dutch television, I see Fry on.
Yeah, well, it had been on British television a little bit earlier as well, yeah, absolutely. I'm so glad, because I started telling this story in 2018, and I would get blank faces, so that makes me really happy. So Benno went into hiding, before we get to the city registry. Benno went into hiding, and there's something important to say about Benno's experience in hiding, which is, we like to talk about people like Miep Gijs and the Ten Boms, like people who hid Jewish people because they thought it was the right thing to do. We don't really talk about the fact that there were also a lot of people who charged Jewish people exorbitant fees for bad conditions. And that's mostly what Benno saw. So his experience of the war was not just hiding, but trying to survive these terrible conditions. And as, 21-year-old kid, trying to figure out a way to get his hands on enough money to afford his hiding place. He actually ended up making ladies' bags during the war as a way to fund his time in hiding. I'm so glad you guys know about Frida. Frida, I'm going to repeat it for people who haven't heard it. So Frida met up with a painter called Willem Arondius. Now, I said I'd do it in English. William Arondius. No, I know. I was trying to do it in English because my Dutch accent throws people, so I'm trying to stick in English. And so for years, I've been telling this story as Willem was an openly gay painter. But what's interesting is listening to Frida's account that she gave, and also listening to other historians. Willem dated men, but never talked about it. He wouldn't, according to Frida, they never actually said the words. They never said the thing that they had the most in common. But she and Willem start working together, and they're doing forgeries, and they're doing ID cards. After the February strike, the Nazis really ramped up the crackdown on the community, so Frida and her group ramped up their production of these fake ID cards, these ID cards that took the J off so that it didn't identify you as Jewish. And they realized they had a problem. They had distributed thousands of these ID cards, but all it was going to take was one Nazi officer checking it against the city registry. And not only would that person get busted, but they would realize that there was a large-scale forgery going on. So they decided to blow up the registry. It took a lot of planning. I think that's something I didn't really realize before I started researching this. It took them months. They had to figure out the people guarding the registry. Did the guards on the registry know all of the police officers that were in the neighborhood? Who was in there? Where did they have to go in the registry? So it took this meticulous planning. And they got the police uniforms, they got everything they needed to seize the registry. And they told Frida she couldn't go because there weren't female police officers. So they were afraid that Frida would give it away. So Frida was on a roof nearby as this is happening. And Willem and the other men, they go in, they knock out the guards, pull the janitors out, they steal 600 passbooks, 50,000 guilders, and blow up 800,000 records. It's a huge success. And the Nazis put a lot of energy into finding out who did it. So at this point, surveillance is already so intense that this little tiny resistance cell doesn't actually meet. They all have check-ins with each other. So Frida had a check-in with this guy, Rudy. They were supposed to pass each other on the street. And when Rudy didn't show, Frida knew that he had been arrested. So Frida goes into hiding. One of the stories she tells from this time is that she was hiding as a man and that she passed her mother on the street and her mother didn't recognize her. Maybe that's true. It also strikes me as something where her mother might have recognized her and not said anything. But Frida soon realizes that she's endangering the people she's staying with because the Nazis are so desperate to get everyone involved and they have Frida's name. So she makes a plan to escape, but then she destroys her back. The place that she's staying has this really heavy iron bed that has to be moved to get to the hiding space. And one time when she's trying to get to the hiding space, she herniates it. So yeah, one of the problems with being in hiding is how you get to a hospital. So she uses a fake ID, she goes to this hospital, and the woman who's signing her in asks for her ration cards. And she says she doesn't have any. And the woman says, oh, you can bring them back later. And Frida says, no, I don't have any. And at that point, the woman knows that Frida is in hiding. She could have turned her in. But instead she goes, okay, you're going to bring it back later. Frida's back gets fixed, and then she finally gets to escape, but it's February. So she's going down through Belgium, and she has a way that's going to take her to Switzerland. But when she's in Paris, she finds out that that way is blown. The Germans have found it. So she's stuck in Paris. She has nowhere to stay. She doesn't know anyone. She finally gets a connection that can get her across the border. And so Frida and Tony, this connection, walk to this farmhouse in a blizzard. And when they get to the farmhouse, the couple in the farmhouse says, you have to go back. There's no way you can cross this river in a blizzard. And they say, we don't have a back to go to. So they walk in the blizzard to this freezing river. And when they get there, they strip down and walk across this river, their clothes over their head, and then walk into Switzerland. Frida is able to spend the rest of the war in Switzerland. Benno turns 25 the day that the country is finally liberated. And then 2 days later, he discovers that he and his brother are his family's sole survivors. Frida comes back, and she says, the people who were riding the fence, they're the ones in charge. We had thought that the world would change after the war, and instead everything stayed the same. She uses her American connection to leave for the US. And it's okay if this is kind of like a heavy thing to take in. I have to say, I have a lot of trouble kind of living with this history. The year I launched my gay history tour, I spent like months at ILIA researching every little aspect I could find of queer history in the Netherlands. And the week before Pride, I spent it researching those prosecutions I told you about. So I was sitting in the city archive, reading the torture and interrogation notes of gay men in Amsterdam in 1730. And so when I got to Pride, I had no forgiveness in my heart. I was just walking down the Amstel and I was angry at everyone. I, of all people, know that you cannot tell someone if someone is queer from the outside. And yet, I just assumed that every remotely straight-seeming person was cosplaying. And I saw a drag queen dancing on a boat above the logo of a bank that I know has investments in a country where they kill gay people, and I wanted to scream, I wanted to yell, I wanted to get in everyone's face and point out the hypocrisy. And then it was almost like a lens slotting into place. I looked across the Amstel, and on the other side of the Amstel, I saw the Six House, which is a family that has controlled Amsterdam politics for generations. And I saw the Six House completely crowded with people cheering for Pride. And I saw in front of the Six House, all up and down the Amstel, these huge waving rainbow crowds. And then above, in one of the Gemeente buildings, I saw the various Pride flags waving. And I thought what it would mean to these four men whose torture I was reading about, Johannes, Peter, Cornelis, and Maurits. What it would mean to them to know that someday that same city would come out to celebrate its LGBTQ members. And then the next thing I saw was a boat full of LGBTQ supporting parents. And I told you what that means to me. What it meant for my classmates who had to hang on by their fingernails or live on the street. All I could think of is what must it be like for these kids to grow up in a world where their parents support them, where their straight classmates get a reminder every single year that we should celebrate the spectrum of gender and the spectrum of sexual orientation. And that sense of the next generation gave me so much hope that it actually let me go back to that horrible research the following day. Benno described the end of the war as a kind of liberation. He said, nothing worse could happen to me than had already happened. And as some of you may know, he went on to turn himself into a beacon. First, he made himself quite well known through his design. So the Bijenkorf, which you guys all know is this big department store in Dam Square, the Nazis had just run it into the ground, and it looked like one more thing that was going to disappear during the war. But I swear to God, Benno helped revive it by turning the shop windows into these like design centerpieces. I've actually seen footage of people from the country getting off at Central Station and coming down the Damrak just to see a department store window unveiled at the Bijenkorf. There's not a lot to do here during the 1950s. He also designed this lamp that everyone had, and he designed this rug that everyone had. So I want you to imagine it's like 1964. You're, somewhere in the Platteland, somewhere in the countryside. You're sitting down in front of your TV. You've got this lamp that Benno's designed here. You've got this rug that he's designed under your feet. You're maybe like wearing something that you got at the Bijenkorf when you went to go see one of the window unveilings. And you sit down and you turn on the TV, and there's Benno Premsela. And he is talking on this well-known program about his life as a gay man. He's the first one to do it. Gerard Rewe, a writer who wrote about gay relationships, had kind of acknowledged it in passing on kind of this literary program, but Benno sat down and he's like, let me tell you what this is like. It was an incredible humanizing moment because most people had thought of queer people as like some other that I don't have a relationship to. So Benno sitting down and doing that was incredibly important. He had also recently taken over the COC in his own name, which was something that people didn't do. I mean, the COC itself kind of sounded like a pseudonym. Like the COC stands for like Culture and Meeting Center. And certainly the people who ran it all used pseudonyms. But Benno was determined to be out. And this had a huge impact on people. But someone they knew, someone they admired even, was queer. Frida, meanwhile, was kind of having the other experience in California. She managed to get from New York to California on a road trip, and she started out kind of as a studio, I almost said magician, a studio musician. And then when people found out who she was actually asked to form an orchestra. So she formed the Orange County Philharmonic, which was a very popular orchestra. And I'm going to tell you her version of the story. Her version of the story is that she never hit on anyone, she never said anything about being queer, but that these women would just throw themselves at her. She has a story about one of the wealthy donors. She gets back to her car one night, and one of the wealthy donors is draped across the car, and Frida can't get rid of her. I'm gonna believe it. You guys can choose to believe what you want to. Unfortunately, eventually, Frida's contract was not renewed. And it's an interesting moment in the interview with her, because it seems pretty clear that she wants to say homophobia is behind it, but she also doesn't want to say homophobia is behind it. She spends this long part of her interview talking about how she doesn't think of herself as gay, she's never identified as gay, she's never run into anti-Semitism or homophobia. She just wonders after the fact if, oh, was that anti-Semitism? Oh, was that homophobia? And I think so much about the difference between how Benno experienced that and how Frida experienced that. This interview that I keep referencing is something she did at the end of her life. She sat down with the US Holocaust Museum and she spent 2 days telling them everything from when she was born all the way through to the end of her life. So I've got primary sources here. Benno, meanwhile, went on to be this really unifying figure. He was referred to as the Pope of gays. And one of the reasons he was such a unifying figure happened in the 1960s and 70s. So for most of the 1900s, there was a law that all it technically did was set the age of consent for queer people at 21, but it was used in a bunch of ways to justify police harassment. So this law was still in the books in the 60s, and because this law was on the books, these university groups started forming throughout the 60s because they weren't allowed into the COC. The COC, which was the longest continuously running gay rights organization in the world, was afraid that if they let in university members, they would be disbanded. So these groups called zoos started forming at these different universities. And they took kind of the opposite approach. So the COC was the generation or maybe even 2 generations ahead of them. And their approach was kind of what Benno did on that TV show. Their approach was very much can I show people that queer people are just like them and we integrate by being just like them? Whereas these zoos that were forming in the 60s, they were no, we want to be who we are. We're going to show that we have a right to take up space. So these zoos would go into just normal dance clubs, and men would dance with men and women would dance with women. They do kiss-ins in big squares. It was really this kind of politics through confrontation. And in January of 1969, which I want to point out is before Stonewall, January of 1969, 100 students gather at the Binnenhof for the first large public protest to end 248 bis, this law that was used to attack gay people. Of course, then Stonewall happens, and there's all this energy. And finally, in 1971, 248 bis is removed, but there's still this huge divide. There's this huge gap in the community of the younger people who are oh, the COC doesn't mean anything, the COC is all about conforming, and we're all about being different. And it really looked like maybe there wouldn't be younger people in the COC. Maybe the generations would go like this. And one of the things that I find really impressive is that Benno reached out to these groups and kind of, person by person almost, created a healing so that these zoos eventually all got formed into the COC. And the COC moved a little bit to the left, which probably should have. And the student groups moved a little bit to the right, but the community stayed unified. And that's what Benno was for most of his life. He was even part of the community that helped choose the design for the Homo Monument. So these three generations, they left their mark in really different ways. But that mark of generations, I think, is really important. One of my best Pride memories is actually here. It was a Pride where my partner and my friends, we all wanted to go to sit on the Prinsengracht. So we got to the Prinsengracht super early, like no one was there. We put down blankets on the side so we could sit down, and we watched like this huge balloon bouquet of like penis balloons kind of floating this way on the other side of the canal. And there was a houseboat over here that kept playing Lovely Day and Leif like 20 different times. And I know that sounds obnoxious, but I actually fell in love with both those songs. They're still two of my favorite songs that I play all the time. And my friends hadn't gotten there yet, so it was just me and my partner. When this group from Philips was kind of going around taking Polaroids of different people. And so they stopped us, and they took this Polaroid, and they took this picture that right now is next to my door. It's the first thing I see, or the last thing I see before I leave my house. And it's this picture, I'm wearing a rainbow heart shirt, I'm wearing my rainbow necklace, which has stayed with me since my first Pride. And my partner has his arm around me, and he's holding a little sign that says, "You are you," and he's smiling at me. And then the frame of this little photograph says, "Life is better when you are you." And it was such a beautiful moment, both because it seemed like where my life had culminated to, being in this place where I could really revel in pride, but also we're sitting on the Prinsengracht, this place of huge history, and I know the generations that came before us. Whether you're queer or Jewish or both, I think part of our power is that our sense of generation is not just my grandparents and my grandparents' friends. Our sense of generation is that we know the stories of people who came before us for generation after generation after generation. And sometimes they're strong and sometimes they're sad, but we are the inheritance of all of that. And if you're incredibly lucky, you get to be the person that you needed when you were young. You get to be the elder that you wanted and needed. When I was having that horrible experience as a teenager, there was a bisexual poet whose poetry helped me survive. And now I do all this history storytelling for exactly that reason. I want to tell people the stories that they need to hear. So my hope for all of us is that our eyes will be open to this incredible spiritual heritage that we are heirs to, and that we will turn around and deliver that to the generations after ours. Thank you so much for listening to this story. Some of you would like to maybe head into somewhere cooler, but I'm going to hang out. So if you have any questions about the people we talked to, if you have any stories, because I would imagine some of you have stories that I haven't heard yet. If you have any stories you'd like to tell me, I'd love to hear them. But otherwise, I'm just going to say thank you, and I hope you'll come back to the Jewish Museum.